Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Let me just make sure that we are on all our channels. Okay, I think we are all set. All right, I think we're all set. We're on all our channels. And it is just about 9 o'clock. So let me go ahead and just make sure that everything is okay on our end. And it seems to be, so I'm just going to hop on over to our Facebook group and just see if there are any questions posted there before we get started. If you can just type in wherever you're watching this from, whether that's Facebook, our private Facebook group, or our public Facebook group, I'd love to know where you're watching us from, where you are in this process. If you're a pre-med, if you're in college, if you're in a gap year, if you're currently in the process, if you're a medical student, maybe thinking about residency, I'd love to know where everyone is watching us from and sort of what stage of the process you're in. And then, of course, if you have any questions, you can go ahead, you can put them in the comments, again, wherever you're watching this from. That would be terrific. So happy Thursday. Yes. All right. So Julie asks, what is the best way to prepare for medical school interviews? And this is a great question. And I can tell you that we are still very much actively preparing our students for interviews, some of whom who have had multiple interviews, others who maybe they're about to go on their first or their second interview. We still have students who are receiving medical school interviews this season. So it most certainly is not too late in the process to still get interviews. In fact, just today we had a student who received an interview from a top medical school. So that should give everybody hope. So the best way to prepare for a medical school interview is, first of all, you want to review your application. That may seem pretty basic, but it's been a while since you submitted that application. So you want to refresh your memory. What did you write? What's on there? What experiences did you emphasize? And you also want to focus on what isn't on your application. So when you submitted your application, it was probably either the beginning of May, if it was, for osteopathic or Texas medical schools, or you submitted it at the end of May, if it was for allopathic medical schools through MCAT. So a lot has probably happened between now and when you submitted that application. That's many months. And for high achieving students, certainly you've accomplished something. So you want to sort of keep in mind what the reader, the person who's reading your application, what they know about you based on the application, and what you ideally want them to know that has happened since you submitted that application. So that's number one. I would say that depending on how many interviews you've gone on, we certainly have students who have gone on a number of interviews at this point in the cycle. And so for those students, we often tell them, don't do any preparation. Your preparation has already happened, especially if you've gotten good results from the interviews that have come before this. Okay, we use those interviews kind of as a gauge to some extent, depending on how many you've had, depending on where those interviews were, and depending on when the decision release dates are for those interviews. But we use those interviews as a gauge for how you're doing. What were the tricky questions? What things kind of threw you off a bit? What were the results of those interviews? And depending on, how you've done on your previous interviews, we may say, no more practice for you, because we don't want you to get to the point where you're sounding memorized, you're sounding rehearsed. And so it's as important to know when you need to practice more as it is to know when you need to stop practicing. So if this is your first interview, I would most definitely recommend doing at least one mock interview. A mock interview is really to get you comfortable with the process, to get you comfortable speaking about yourself, and to kind of help you understand from an outsider's perspective, what are the things about your candidacy that really make you stand out? What are the things that you want to be trying to emphasize during your interview, assuming it's not an MMI? What are the things that you want to be mentioning during that interview? Because there's always sort of leeway to potentially direct an interview and bring up the things that you know are important about your candidacy. And so we try to kind of go over that with our students. Now, of course, if it's an MMI interview, completely different type of interview, it's a scenario-based interview, you want, again, to be sort of comfortable with how to approach those questions. If you have not gotten a copy of my medical school interview book, I encourage you to do so. I wrote it before virtual interviews were a thing, so certainly it's missing something on the virtual interview front, but otherwise everything in that book still applies today. It's a great resource. It gives you a really good structure for kind of how to approach the MMI interview, which you might not necessarily use that structure as you become a little bit more fluent in MMIs, but it really gets students to kind of be able to approach the MMI interview in a sort of methodical way that allows them to give the most comprehensive answers. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, I realize I went on for a bit. It's a big question, how to prepare for interviews. What are the statistics for international students who are getting admitted to medical school in the US in your student cohort? Our international students who are getting accepted to medical school, they have really phenomenal statistics. Now, keep in mind that GPAs, we don't pay as much attention to GPAs, frankly, as we do to MCATs. And that's because so many undergraduate colleges now have grade inflation. We're seeing the same thing in high schools. So everybody has very, very high GPAs. So it's more that we want to make sure that you reach a certain threshold of competitiveness. So I'd say our most competitive students have a 3.8 or higher GPA. I can tell you that our international students who are getting accepted certainly are within that cohort. And our international students as well, most of them, not all of them, but most of them have MCATs of like 515 or higher. Of course, there are always going to be outliers to this. I mean, we had one student who, I think it was a year ago, who got into a medical school without having an MCAT, an extremely unusual situation. This person had really proven themselves at that medical school, was well known to them. And so, we always look at things, very individually. So, things are going to happen outside the norm, but those are sort of the basic guidelines. I'd say the top students are going to have a 3.8 or higher, 515 or higher, even better if you have like a 517 or above on the MCAT. Okay, nervous mom here, still waiting, hoping for some acceptances and more interviews. If you've had multiple interviews already and you don't have any acceptances, we want to look at when did you interview. We want to ask you how those interviews went. Where were those interviews? Have those schools released any decisions yet? But generally speaking, if you've had 3 or more interviews, you should get an acceptance. Most students, it's been shown, who get accepted to medical school have 3 or fewer interviews. So if you've had multiple interviews, which is what you imply, we would expect acceptances. And yes, there are still interviews that are going to be extended, certainly. I mean, we're getting to that point where they're really just going to be trickling very, very slowly. But certainly January, we still definitely see interviews extended. Would an SMP, a special master's program, be a good way to boost a GPA? Yes, a special master's program. These are programs that are specifically designed for medical school applicants who did not do as well in their undergraduate college performance as they wanted to. And they're specifically designed for students who have, for the most part, taken all of their medical school prerequisites, but need to prove themselves. So they're called grade academic enhancer or grade enhancer type of programs. And for many students, this is definitely the way to go if the student needs to prove themselves academically. I'd say one of the, if you want to look them up, one of the best known SMP programs is at Georgetown. They have great results. There are more and more SMP programs that are popping up all over the place because they're a great way for undergraduate institutions to make money, to bring in tuition dollars. And there is a searchable database for all of the SMP programs through the AMC. And you probably can just Google that. And we can also just post that in the chat for you after this live, or, maybe I can ask someone to do that right now on our end. But there is a great searchable database where you can find all of the special master's programs, not the osteopathic special master's programs. Now, that's something else to think about as well. If you're aiming to go to osteopathic medical school, or depending how competitive you are at the undergraduate level, you might think about an osteopathic special master's program. So 2 very different paths. Hi, Camille. How are you? Okay. Stephanie asks, what is the best resource for researching medical schools, like whether they are community service-based, dedicated to serving a local area, or whatever their unique characteristic they may have? Something you're going to find, Stephanie, as you start researching medical schools is that mission statements sound identical. You're going to say, this mission statement sounds just like that mission statement. And frankly, this is because all medical schools really have the same mission. They want to serve patients. They want to serve the community. They want to advance science and research and understanding and knowledge. The best way to get a sense of that, frankly, is based on location. So if you are looking at a school that's in a rural area, they're probably going to have an emphasis on rural medicine. You can then go to the medical school's website and you can look at their mission, and you can look at what their different programs are, what their different departments are in. I always encourage students and parents, when they're really doing a deep dive into medical schools, don't just look at the medical school website, look at the hospital website, because whatever the affiliated hospitals are, because students are really spending 2 years at the medical school itself. And then the last 2 years of medical school, the vast majority of the student's time is going to be spent in the affiliated hospitals at that institution. So you don't only want to look at the medical school websites to get a sense of what the missions are. You want to look at the hospital websites. So that probably is the best way, is, to get a sense, is to look at each individual medical school website. Look for their primary and affiliated institution. So, like, for example, and again, I was an admissions officer at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, so I know it very well. So, like, for example, the 2 primary clinical sites for Mount Sinai are Mount Sinai on the Upper East Side, serves a very, very diverse population because it shoulders both the Upper East Side and East Harlem. Okay, so you get, it's really at this sort of crossroads of a very wealthy area and an underserved area. And then you have Elmhurst Hospital, which is the other main affiliate of Mount Sinai, and students rotate through there. And that is in Jackson Heights, Queens. Incredibly diverse population, actually the most diverse population based on census data in the US. And that is an experience unlike any other. So, by looking at sort of where you're going to be doing your clinical rotations and looking at those websites of those hospitals, you're going to get a sense of the missions and what your student's going to experience as a student. Any specific preparation for MMI interviews, I would, as I mentioned before, I would definitely recommend getting my book. You can find it on Amazon. If you just search up, Med Edits Jessica Freedman Medical School Interview on Amazon, it will pop up. I give a great framework there for how to approach the MMI, how to think about scenarios, and how to apply that framework to a whole bunch of different scenarios. And then the best way, once you kind of understand that framework, is then to practice. And we certainly do practice with our students for MMI interviews until they feel comfortable. Some students are going to feel comfortable after, one session. Other students need multiple sessions. And I can tell you, we see dramatic improvement as we practice with our students. I mean, I have one student I'm working with personally this year. And when we started, they had a very difficult time with the MMI, and this student is now an expert. I'm like, you're done practicing. You can handle any scenario. So practice certainly, makes for greater comfort and, allows the student to be able to navigate any scenario quite fluently. What is the minimum MCAT, minimum range of MCAT for MD and DO. Well, this varies because minimum MCATs are going to depend on a lot of things. They're going to depend, first of all, on your ethnicity. And the AAMC is going, they post what, and we have this on our website as well, but they post what the average MCATs are for different ethnic groups. So you first want to consider, okay, what is the average for the group that I am a part of? That's number one. Then you want to consider what is the average MCAT for the specific medical school. So for example, if you are from certain states and you're interested in going to those state medical schools, some of those state medical schools are going to have fairly low average MCATs versus other medical schools. But they only take in-state residents. So you want to consider that as well. I would say our comfort level right now for a student who wants to go to an allopathic MD granting medical school, we like them to ideally have a 512 or higher. That said, we have students who get into allopathic medical schools with lower than that, but there often are other things that kind of make that applicant stand out in a certain way or put them in a different category. For osteopathic medical schools, we like to see an MCAT around a 506, 507. Again, there are going to be variations on that too. There is variation in terms of competitiveness of osteopathic medical schools too. So, again, a lot of variables, but I'd say those are ballpark numbers: 512 for MD, 506, 507 for DO. If you can get a copy of my book, just if you go onto Amazon and you just search medical school interview, med edits, Jessica Freedman, it should pop up. Okay. Would you recommend, I realize I'm not putting these on the screen, I apologize. Would you recommend someone apply to medical school as an international student from India who is doing undergraduate from the US? How hard is it to get in compared to domestic applicants? So certainly if a student is doing their undergraduate work here in the US, this makes it easier, especially depends on where the student is an undergraduate. Are they an undergraduate at a school that has an affiliated medical school, or maybe they're doing research with someone who's affiliated with that medical school who can write them a letter of recommendation. So I would definitely say that it's if you are international, this is not including Canadians, but if you're international and you want to go to medical school in the US, your best bet is going to be to go to college here in this country. It's going to be, nothing's ever impossible, but it's going to be very, very, very difficult if you are applying from an international undergraduate institution as an international citizen to go to med school here. Okay. For clinical experience, is it better to work as an EMT in a hospital or a local town EMT volunteer? Well, if you're working as EMT in a hospital, that means so you're working for the hospital ambulance service. I'm not going to say that one is definitively better than the other. It's going to depend on what the student's experience is going to be in either of those settings. How much responsibility are they going to get? And how many patients are they going to see? I mean, when I think of working as an EMT for a hospital, for example, if you're doing that in a city, you're probably going to be really busy and going on a lot of calls and seeing a really, really diverse mix of patients versus if you're working, let's say, in a suburban town and volunteering for, a town EMT, you might get one call a day, right? So that may not be very busy. So I would opt for the opportunity where you're going to be seeing the most patients and where you're going to be the busiest and you're going to have the most responsibility. That's how I'd gauge those opportunities. Okay. May I know all the aspects that we need to consider when choosing a pre-med college? Are H4 eligible, are H4 students eligible for BSMD? What are the steps we need to take since we joined the pre-med college to get high possible chances of getting into a medical college without any gap? So Getting into a U.S. medical college as a non-U.S. citizen is much tougher, as I've already said earlier in this live. So if you just are tuning in, please watch the recording. In terms of students who are able to go to med school straight from college without a gap year. So that means applying at the end of the junior year of college and then applying during the senior year and going straight from undergrad to medical school. And we work with students every year who do this. Taking a gap year is not absolutely necessary. Those students, I can tell you, they hit the ground running as soon as they start college. That means that from the beginning, they're getting the highest grades. They are organized. They're immediately getting involved in research, in clinical exposure, in volunteer work. So these are really very, very focused, very, very driven students who are spending, I would say, the majority of their undergraduate careers in the library or working. So, and certainly we work with students who are very, very successful in this process who apply at the end of junior year. I don't think it's a must to take a gap year. We generally recommend gap years for students because, frankly, either most students don't want to spend their undergraduate years that focused and that intense. They also want to have, some time to have fun, and they want to have some time to explore, and they want, both academically and wherever they are in the world. But we recommend gap years when we feel a student, needs to strengthen their extracurricular profile. Maybe they also need that extra time to be able to take the MCAT, because if you're talking about applying at the end of your junior year, then that means you need to be taking an MCAT with a submittable score by June of your junior year at the absolute latest. And that is sometimes very, very difficult for students to be able to fit all of that in. Sometimes they just don't want to. So, and plus real world experience, I think, is always a good thing. Gives you more to talk about in interviews. You're generally more mature, you're more sophisticated. So it's a balance. It's a very personal decision. Okay. Are there SMPs that are geared towards specific medical specialties? There are not. There is, oh my gosh, an associate anesthetist degree, but that's not really an SMP. That's like a training program, which I think would be an interesting thing to do, frankly, as before medical school. But SMPs are not geared towards specific medical specialties. No. Okay, Brigido asks, my daughter had an interview on November 29th. 2 weeks ago, she called the school and they said it's under review. She has another interview towards the end of February, no additional interviews. Should she send a letter of intent or wait until she completes the second interview? Well, Brigido, it depends. If that first school is your daughter's top choice versus school A and school B, then absolutely she can send a letter of intent stating your school is my top choice. I will attend if accepted. However, if she thinks that school B that she's interviewing at the end of February, if she thinks that may be her top choice, then I would hold off sending that letter of intent. So I think it depends on, what she wants, if you want to actually send that letter of intent now. How do you determine which MCAT prep is best for your student? We ask students, what has worked for you in the past? Are you a great self-studier? Do you need a structured course? How would you, at this point, all students are comfortable and familiar with online learning. Are you okay with virtual online platforms? Do you need a live platform? So we find out what has worked for the student in the past. Do you have to work with a tutor? I can tell you that for MCAT prep, most students don't just jump right into tutoring because there is a ton of content review that needs to happen that most students in our experience either can do on their own by getting a set of books. I find that Kaplan tend to be the most popular self-study books that students get, or they take a course. And honestly, all of the courses are the same because the MCAT content has not changed in a while. So you want to choose a course that has been around for a long time. I don't hear any differences between Kaplan and Princeton Review. They're all, they're all good. I would choose the one that works best for the student in terms of the scheduling and in terms, again, of the mode of instruction. Are they okay with a recorded course? Do they want a live virtual course? Do they want a live in-person course? So that, again, has to do with the student and their individual learning styles. And then once you start, and of course, students also use Anki decks. They use UWorld a lot in terms of self-preparation. We do have many students who prep for the MCAT on their own without taking a course, and they do very well. So it's really an individual preference. And then if you then, let's say, need some pointed strategy prep, that's when we think about bringing in a tutor. And we have a couple of tutors whom we recommend. Okay. Does every applicant to med school get an interview request, or is it selective? It is very, very selective. So no, I'd say that probably, it varies, but probably 10% at the highest, at the most selective schools, maybe even fewer, actually get interview requests. So you'd have to look at that data to figure out what the percentage is. But no, most applicants do not get interviews. Hold on. Okay, I'm just going through all. There are a lot of good questions tonight. What is MMI? I'm so sorry. MMI is a multiple mini interview. It is an interview type that was started in Canada. It's a situational interview format where students rotate through stations and they are given scenarios, not necessarily medically related scenarios. You're not expected to know anything. You're not expected to have any knowledge. A layperson should be able to navigate these scenarios. And traditionally, each scenario is about 8 minutes long. In my experience, most US medical schools have hybrid MMI interviews where maybe they have a couple traditional questions and then they have a few MMI stations, or even the MMI stations aren't, the interviewer is supposed to be very stone-faced and not give any feedback. And, I just find that, US medical school interviewers are still, kind of more aligned with a traditional type of interview. And so many of them, kind of break the rules, so to speak. So that, I hope that gives you a good summary. How many times can someone take the MCAT to school? Do scores have to be reported to the med schools while applying? So a student, every single MCAT score is reported to the medical school. So you don't super score. It's not like college admissions with the SAT and ACT. And this is why we recommend, if it's possible, taking the MCAT a maximum of twice, because the medical schools see every single score. If you want, you can either look on our website for my article about the MCAT, or you can get my book about medical school admissions, which it goes over the different sort of MCAT patterns that we typically see with students who take the MCAT more than once. And some of those score patterns are less convincing when it comes to improvement. So for example, if a student just keeps taking the MCAT over and over again, and like they go up by 1 point each time, that's not such a convincing testing pattern. So you want to ideally go into the MCAT the first time as prepared as you can possibly be and try to get the highest score possible. If you then must take it a second time, you want to reevaluate, what did I do wrong? You don't just want to, kind of jump right back in and retake the test unless you can identify what went wrong and it's easy to fix. But otherwise, you want to put in another full course of study to retake that test the second time to improve. Lisa asks, do medical schools view college athletes more favorably? Do admissions see this as a positive attribute? Absolutely. So, college athletes who have been on varsity teams and athletics were a huge part of their college career, medical school admissions committees understand the dedication that takes, the focus, and sort of how those attributes are really also very, very important in medical school as well as in the practice of medicine. And so this is most definitely viewed favorably. Those students still have to be competitive, though, in terms of, having all of the other experiences that other medical school applicants have. But yes, I would say that definitely is respected in the medical school admissions process. Okay. I heard that if a student with a top tier GPA, MCAT research, clinical experience, etc., apply to mid to lower tier schools, they may not get an interview from these schools. These schools have fixed number of interview slots, and they won't waste slots on students that might get admitted to better schools. So this is something called yield protect. I think that we hear about this a lot in the college admissions process as well, where students who have very, very high scores and are very, very competitive sometimes will not be considered seriously by schools that, let's say, are less competitive. I'd say this in large part depends on what type of school you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about a state school, every state school sees any applicant from their state, regardless of how competitive that student is, sees that student as a very possible viable student in their future, because many students go to their state schools because it makes financial sense to them. I would say that yield protect, meaning not interviewing someone because you think they're going to go somewhere else, I would say it's becoming less common because, frankly, things are just becoming more and more and more competitive. So I'm not seeing this as much as we used to. I think it still happens to a degree, but not to the degree it did, let's say, 5-10 years ago. Okay, we have a lot of good questions tonight, so I'm just going through all of them. Do the schools talk to each other? Do they know who is interviewing at other schools? No, the schools do not talk to each other. At a certain point in the application process, if you have accepted a position at a certain school, the school will know that, but they don't talk to each other in terms of who is interviewing who. They just don't have time to do this. Okay. While doing research, is it a must to publish a paper? It is not a must to get published. Is it great to get published? And is it a wonderful accomplishment? And does it look great on an application? Absolutely. But everybody knows that research is not predictable. Getting published is not predictable. Findings are not predictable. And no one expects you to get published. So it's what's more important is the quality of your research, what you're learning through that experience, how much time you've devoted to that experience, what your principal investigator or whoever your immediate supervisor is, what they're going to write about you in a letter of recommendation, what your contributions have been through that research experience. That's what becomes much, much more important versus getting the publication. Now, that is not to say that if you, let's say, have been involved in research for a couple of years and you have several publications, presentations, abstracts because of that work, is that wonderful? Yeah, that's wonderful. And that sort of is showing that you're already an expert in something. And so that is, definitely favorable in the admissions process. But we have plenty of students who have not been published, who are getting into medical school, who are getting into the most competitive medical schools. Okay, Michael asks, what kind of things do interviewers look for at a medical school admissions interview? I have to try to answer this in a nutshell because that's a loaded question. If you buy my book, it's all in there. They are looking, if you look up the core competencies that the AAMC provides. You can again, this is on our website, but AAMC core competencies, that's what medical school admissions committees are looking for. And in terms of, empathy, understanding, ability to communicate, commitment to a career in medicine, an understanding of what it means to be a physician, an ability to, someone who's personable. There are just so many different qualities and characteristics that medical school admissions committees are looking for. And fundamentally, because they have all of your information in front of them, they have your application, they know about your achievements, they know about your grades and your academic performance and your MCAT score. And sometimes it comes down to the fact, do they like you? Do they see you as someone who's going to be making a contribution to their medical school, to their medical school class? And do they see you in the profession? So, this is why trying to establish rapport with your interviewer. And of course, we're talking about one-on-one interviews, because the MMI, multiple mini interview, is a totally different way of assessing applicants. But certainly with the one-on-one interview, you want to, as much as possible, try to build that rapport, with your interviewer. And this is also why extroverts tend to do better in a traditional interview process than introverts, because that's what they're good at, is relating to other people. Okay. Okay. My daughter is currently a high school senior. She is planning on doing a medically related internship over the summer, and she wants to go to medical school eventually. Can she eventually put it on her medical school application, or would it not count at all? So technically, whatever you do over the summer counts towards the next academic year. So anything she does this summer after senior year counts towards freshman year. What we find a lot of the time, especially if this is an internship and, it's probably going to be an 8-week, 10-week experience, oftentimes what we find is by the time students are actually applying to medical school, things that they did earlier in their process, so either in high school or very, very early in college, those things often fall off the list in terms of importance. Now, let's say this ends up being an experience that inspires your daughter, and she finds a specific topic or a specific research interest that she then continues to explore. Then it's possible that this might be something that we include on the application. Maybe not even as a specific application entry or description, but maybe as part of her personal statement. So it's possible that that would still stay, and it would be perfectly valid for that to still stay on the application, because it is happening technically during college. But it'll be interesting to see what else she becomes interested in, what else she pursues once she starts college. And then you'll decide if that's if you want to include it or not. Okay. In your experience, is it your experience that physicians whose path to medicine was through DO schools are treated with less respect than those who attended allopathic med school? Osteopathic physicians work alongside allopathic physicians. There is no difference. I can tell you, I have worked in academic settings where where I did my residency at Cook County in Chicago. And then I worked at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where I was on faculty for many years. And we worked alongside, MDs and DOs worked alongside each other. There's no difference. Okay. The patients don't care. They want someone who is competent, who knows what they're doing. They don't care about the letters next to that person's name. And then I can tell you, in the community, after I worked at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, I worked in community medicine in the suburbs. Same thing. MDs and DOs, we all work alongside one another. There is no difference. You earn your respect. So it doesn't have to do with where you went to medical school. And honestly, it has more to do with where you did your training. People in medicine know that it has less to do with where you went to med school and more to do with where did that person train? That's the question that people are going to ask you. And for every specific specialty, there are going to be hospitals that are sort of considered better training grounds than others. And sometimes that may not necessarily align with the best medical school having the best training program in a specific specialty. So there are nuances in this as you go through it. Okay. A lot of questions tonight. Woo, okay. All right. Let me just sift through these. Hold on. Can a student successfully apply with combined 700 hours of clinical experience, medical assistant EMT, or would you suggest a gap year to gain more clinical experience? I know PA schools require 1,000 hours, and I was wondering if MD schools require that much. Yes, so PA schools definitely require a lot of clinical experience. In terms, 700 hours is a lot. So if this is a traditional student who is a current junior, and they've acquired 700 hours of clinical experience. That's a lot, to be doing that as an undergraduate. We would want to know what their goals were: MD school versus osteopathic medical school, what type of medical school, what state are they from, what demographic they are, and what other experiences they have in their background. So we would need to know all of those things to recommend whether or not the student needs a gap year to gain additional experience. But I can tell you that 700 hours, getting all of that amount of experience as an undergraduate while they're in college, that's impressive. So yeah, sorry, sometimes we need more information to answer these questions. Okay. Do medical schools admit students younger than 18? I don't know, honestly. Is there a drawback to being a younger applicant or not? I would say the only drawback potentially is, your peer group. If you're a younger applicant, especially as the average age of medical students, continues to go up, the student may just feel like their peer group is more mature and older than they are. So that's something you'd have to think about. Sometimes when students are very young, we see that as an opportunity to get more, real world experience. So they're better prepared for med school. And so they get that experience that way. But I don't know if meds, I've never heard of a med school taking a student who's younger than 18, but I wouldn't be surprised if it has happened at some point. Okay, sorry, I'm just taking a look at all the questions. Someone said that they took the MCAT today, and the content on psych and biology were very hard, and asking if I've heard that it was a very difficult test. I have not heard that. But I would encourage, sometimes students come out of these tests and they just think, oh my gosh, it was so much harder than the practice tests. I hear that a lot, so it doesn't surprise me because I hear that a lot on, when students come out of exams. But I would have him check with his friends, and you know what? It's done. So let's just see how he does. Sometimes, there are nice surprises. Okay. If the student wants to increase their science GPA, can an additional semester after graduation do this as a sort of self-tailored postbac? Absolutely. So when students need to improve their GPA, they can become part of a formal program. They can potentially stay on for an extra semester or two at their college, or they can design their own postbac, just as you suggested, by taking extension classes or by taking classes elsewhere, and submitting those grades. Absolutely. Does repeating a course because of a bad grade, does it affect admission? So we do not recommend repeating courses if you've gotten a bad grade. And that's because, you would of course we would expect you to do much better on a course that you're taking for the second time. So instead of retaking a class where you didn't do so well, we would recommend taking a higher level class in that same discipline, which essentially disproves that initial grade. Any course that you've taken and that appears on your transcript must be reported to MCAS. So it's not as if that grade is going away. It's not as if it's being averaged, unless for some reason your undergraduate college has a policy where if you retake a class that it falls off your transcript, but I've never heard of that. So we generally do not recommend retakes. We recommend sort of going above and beyond what you did previously. Okay. Is it true that better med schools will get you into better training programs? Generally speaking, the more competitive the medical school, the more competitive their match list. But I can tell you that every year when we have students who are trying to decide where to attend, we review match lists. And I'm always impressed by match lists. So really any US allopathic medical school can get you the residency that you want. Sometimes you have to work a little bit harder or a little bit differently to get into a specific specialty or into a specific program. If you're coming from, let's say, a less competitive medical school, or you're in one part of the country, you want to go to a different part of the country. And this is where we get into, kind of the residency strategy of, how do you match into a residency program? But the general way to look at this is if you look at a medical school's match list and you look at the number of matches in the most competitive specialties in medicine. So things like plastic surgery, dermatology, ophthalmology, otolaryngology. You look at sort of a few of those specialties and you see what number of students, what percentage of their students are matching into those really competitive specialties. And, generally speaking, you're going to find that the more competitive medical schools are going to have a higher percentage of students matching into those specialties, keeping in mind that there are some medical schools that are very primary care focused. And so most of the students going to those medical schools don't want to match into those very competitive specialties. You sort of have to look at it in that way as well. Okay, we're coming to the end here. So I'm just going to choose a couple more questions. With an MCAT score of 5.8, 515, it may not be a sure shot to get into MD school due to various factors, but if they apply for DO schools, will they be considered overqualified and not get an interview? 515 is very competitive for an allopathic school, so I'm wondering what those other factors are that make the student not competitive for allopathic med school. But let's say there are significant factors that make them not competitive for allopathic med school. The osteopathic med schools are going to see that too. So they're going to say, okay, this student has a 515, but we realize that they're not going to necessarily be competitive for allopathic med schools. So, they're looking at the same application, the same experiences, the same criteria. And so I would not say that they'd get screened out of osteopathic med schools. No, that doesn't happen. Okay. What is your recommendation for BSMD versus undergraduate from a biochem major and MCAT med school route? So this is sort of a question about, should a student do a BSMD versus going the traditional med school route of going to undergrad, taking the MCAT, going to med school? The primary benefit of a BSMD program is that it guarantees you admission to a medical school. Sometimes sometimes you have to take the MCAT, sometimes you don't. You usually have to score a minimum MCAT score to guarantee your admission to that med school. That's the primary benefit of a BSMD program. And honestly, that's the only benefit of a BSMD program, because it takes away the stress of having to apply to med school, feeling the pressure to take the MCAT. You have to be a really focused student to do a BSMD program. They are hard. You're working hard, especially if you're going to an accelerated program that's 7 years. So you have to be fully committed. And oftentimes a BSMD program, the BS portion of that program is not necessarily going to be at a top college. So you have to really be aware of what the undergraduate experience is that you're going to have and make sure that that's the undergraduate experience that you want. Because oftentimes, BSMD applicants are competitive for very, very selective colleges. So you have to weigh all of that. Tips on getting clinical research positions. So I would say most students get clinical research positions in one of two ways. Either they get this through their college career offices. So if your college is located, in an urban area where there are a lot of surrounding institutions and hospitals, sometimes there will be affiliations that the career office can help you with to get those clinical research positions. Otherwise, I recommend reaching out directly to researchers who are doing research in your area of interest and asking them if they'd be willing to take on a student, either in a paid position or in a volunteer position. And consider if, depending on where you go to college, if you would be able to continue that research during the school year. But I'd say most students are going to be getting clinical research at an institution that's closest to their undergraduate college. This is one of the benefits of going to a college that is in a big city that is potentially affiliated with a medical school, is it does give the students great access to research opportunities. BSMD and BAMD are the same. It's just a Bachelor of Science versus a Bachelor of Arts. Same thing. Okay. What is the latest timeline to submit the final MCAT scores and GPA in the 2024 application cycle? So we recommend submitting your AMCAS application as soon as the system opens, which is the end of May. The latest MCAT that we recommend taking is a June MCAT, but you will be submitting your application without knowing your MCAT score. So you have to be comfortable with that. The timing works such that that MCAT score and your secondary essays will be hitting the office at the same time. So there won't be any delay in the processing of your application. In terms of your GPA, you don't want to wait, potentially depending on when your final grades are going to be available from your college, assuming that you're either a junior or a senior. You may or may not want to wait until that final transcript is updated at the end of the year. Again, this is going to depend on timing because AMCAS needs your transcript to verify your application. So we'd have to talk about the timing. But ideally, you want to be submitting that application the end of May as soon as the system opens. What are your thoughts on University of Pittsburgh for undergrad for a pre-med student? I think Pitt is great. I think you can make the most of opportunities at any large undergraduate institution. Pittsburgh is going to have tremendous opportunities. You're going to have the University of Pittsburgh Medical School that you can take advantage of. And I think at any large undergraduate university, you are going to have so many options that it's just a function of taking advantage of those options. And I can tell you that where you go to college does not matter with regards to your medical school admissions outcomes. What matters is taking advantage of the opportunities that exist at that undergraduate college. So anyway, and doing well in your MCAT. So anyway, okay, so let me see. I think that's it. So anyway, I thank you so much. This was a great group we had tonight. Again, for those of you who I'm just meeting for the first time, my name is Jessica Freedman. I am the chair and founder of MedEdit's Medical Admissions. And, I hope that if you are not a part of our Facebook group, our private Facebook group, that you will join. If you are interested in working with us, you can always sign up for a free consultation, and we welcome that. And I hope that you all stay warm, depending on where you are. It is freezing here in the Northeast. So anyway, so thank you all so much. Have a terrific night. Have a great weekend. And I hope to see you all next week. All right. Bye-bye.